I think Boghossian's paper is very important. I think he may have done for epistemology what Zeno did for dynamics, which is to identify a crucial presupposition of the field that's uncritically assumed and effectively call it into question. I know in my own case, I thought epistemic relativism was a completely hopeless position until I read Boghossian's paper, and now I take it quite seriously. So Boghossian aims to show that epistemic relativism is false, and he also tries to diagnose the intellectual appeal of relativism by constructing a plausible argument for it, and then he tries to show that we don't have good reason to regard the argument as sound, so the argument is specious. Now, although I'm still inclined to agree with all of his conclusions, I'd like to request some clarification concerning certain points in his arguments. And then at the end, I'd like to sketch what seems to me to be a possibly true version of relativism. I doubt that it is true, but I'd like to hear why it isn't. So, first, does Boghossian show that epistemic relativism is false? Well, let's consider his argument for the falsity of epistemic relativism. His argument seems to go like this. If Galileo knew that epistemic relativism is true, then he could not coherently take himself to have any reason to disagree with Bellarmine. But Galileo can coherently take himself to have reason to disagree with Bellarmine, so he cannot possibly know that epistemic relativism is true, and since epistemic relativism can't be an unknowable truth, it follows that it can't be a truth at all. Epistemic relativism is both pragmatically self-defeating and false. Now, I think that's how the argument goes. Now, what worries me about the argument is what I cited as the first premise. Why couldn't Galileo know that relativism is true and still coherently take himself to have reason to disagree with Bellarmine? Why can't he recognize the truth of relativism, but be coherently committed to forming beliefs in accordance with the dictates of his own particular system of epistemic norms? Now, Boghossian considers this challenge in connection with etiquette, and he says something in response to it. So, here is a quote from the paper. What he says in response to this challenge is, quote, "The only rationale for employing the system of epistemic norms that we employ is that they're taken to represent the most reasonable way of arriving at the truth." Okay. Now, if Boghossian is using the term rationale in that quote to refer to our reason for employing the epistemic norms that we employ, then I don't see why we should believe that there is any such rationale at all, right? Why must we have a reason for employing those norms? Why couldn't it just be that we employ those norms simply because we've been trained to do so? But if Boghossian is using the term rationale to refer to an explanation of why we employ the epistemic norms that we employ, then I don't yet see why we should believe his claim, right? Why is it the only explanation of why we employ our particular system of epistemic norms that those norms are taken to represent the most reasonable way of arriving at the truth, right? Why couldn't the historical development of a particular system of epistemic norms be explained in something like the way that we explain the development of a particular language or a particular economic system? Namely, by appealing to a variety of contingent historical forces, none of which involves the evaluation of the developing system by the agents participating in it, right? The fact that we regard our own system of epistemic norms as the most reasonable way of arriving at the truth could just be epiphenomenal, right? Just as it's epiphenomenal in the development of a language that native speakers regard their own language as the easiest and most natural one to use, and epiphenomenal in the development of an economic system that its native participants tend to regard it as recognizing the natural antecedently existing rights of the parties to that economic system. And this is something I encounter whenever I teach Marxism to American students, particularly in North Carolina, is that they think that the great thing about capitalism is that it recognizes people's rights to private property. Okay. So in sum, I don't yet see any reason why epistemic norms could not be as culturally specific and variable as languages and economies are. And so I don't yet see why we should accept Boghossian's argument against epistemic relativism. I mean, once again, I'm strongly inclined to agree with the conclusion, but I'm just not sure that the argument gets us all the way there. So I just want to issue a request for clarification on that point, that we hear a bit more about that. Okay, second issue. Does Boghossian show that the intellectual appeal of epistemic relativism is based on a mistake? Okay. So let's consider the argument that he sets up in favor of epistemic relativism, right? Two-premise argument. Premise one. If there are objectively true epistemic principles, it ought to be possible to arrive at justified beliefs about what they are. Premise two. It is not possible to arrive at justified beliefs about which epistemic principles are objectively true. So, conclusion. Therefore, there are no objectively true epistemic principles. Now, it seems to me that Boghossian is exactly right to offer this argument by way of diagnosis of the intellectual appeal of relativism, and he's also right to regard it as having some plausibility. So let's consider how he responds to it. Well, he denies that we have any good reason to accept premise 2. The consideration that would naturally lead one to accept premise 2 is this, right? When confronted with people who employ different norms, we could not explain why our own epistemic norms are any more correct than theirs. Now, Boghossian's response to that consideration that I've just identified is twofold. Okay, first, he says, it's not clear that we are, or even could be, confronted with such people, right? The popular anthropological cases, like the Azande, are not really examples of the kind of deep difference in epistemic norms that they're often taken to be, right? So Bellarmine, for instance, uses observation to determine what the Bible says, and he uses deduction to determine what follows from what the Bible says. Now, Bellarmine declines Galileo's invitation to look through the telescope, not because he has different epistemic norms, but because he has different background beliefs and values. Right? To illustrate this point by analogy, if you tell me that if I look through your telescope, I will then see my beloved and esteemed father having sex with a goat, well, I will refuse to look through your telescope, and I will insist that you are certainly wrong. But the reason for this is not that my epistemic norms differ from yours, right? Now, on this first point, I agree entirely with Boghossian, and I think his case will seem even stronger if we grant that the contents of our own thoughts are partly constituted by the epistemic norms that we follow with respect to those thoughts. Now, if that's the case, then it'll be very difficult to come up with genuinely conflicting systems of epistemic norms, since many such putative conflicts will really not be conflicts at all, but simply differences of meaning. Okay. Now, of course, this first point that I've just made doesn't destroy the case for premise 2. It just shows that the case will be a lot harder to make than we might have thought. So, to issue a fully effective rebuttal to the case for premise 2, Boghossian needs to say more, and he does. Specifically, he says that even if we were to be confronted with people whose epistemic norms differ from our own, it wouldn't follow that we could, and it's not clear how we should, understand the hypothesis that their norms are no less correct than ours. Now, I agree with Boghossian that this wouldn't follow, and I also agree that it's not clear how we should understand the hypothesis that some alternative system of norms is no less correct than our norms. But I think the reason that this is not clear is that it's not clear what it is for a system of norms to be correct or incorrect at all. More generally, it's not clear, or at least not clear to me, I should say, how to understand the assessment that the relativist wants to make when she says, this system of epistemic norms is just as good or as valid as that one, right? I want to ask, just as good or as valid how? Okay, so while I agree with Boghossian that the case for relativism has not yet been made, I think that part of the reason that it hasn't been made is that we haven't yet been treated to an entirely clear statement of the relativistic thesis. So what I'd like to do in conclusion is offer what I think is a clear statement of relativism, and then explain why I think it's a complicated issue and one that I can't try to settle here, whether or not that form of relativism is true. Now, relativism, so clarified I should mention, is a lot less exciting than the relativistic shibboleths that have become so common in the humanities and that Boghossian, I think, so wisely deplores. But at least this unexciting relativistic thesis does at least stand a chance of being true. Okay, so final section. A boring but possibly true version of epistemic relativism. Okay, well, so let's take an epistemic norm to be a rule governing our thinking about the way the world is, right? In short, our theoretical cognition. Such a rule is of the form, when you're in such and such circumstances, then engage in such and such theoretical cognition, right? Beliefs, judgments, inference, distribution of degrees of confidence, or whatever. So two epistemic norms are inconsistent, we'll say, just in case they have the same antecedents, but their consequence cannot both be true, and both be satisfied. Then I'll say a system of epistemic norms is a maximally consistent collection of norms. Okay. Now, there's an important constraint on the content of such norms. In order for a norm to be binding upon a creature, that creature must at least be able to be trained to follow the norm. So if an epistemic norm is to be binding upon us, if it is to be a norm for us, then we must be able to be trained to discriminate the presence of the conditions mentioned in the antecedent of that norm, right? The antecedent of an epistemic norm, in other words, can mention only those conditions that we can be trained to discriminate. Now, the antecedents of our epistemic norms, if they're to be norms that we can follow, can mention only those conditions that we can be trained to discriminate. But are those conditions going to include only those things that affect the epistemic status of a particular bit of theoretical cognition? Right? In other words, do the differences that we can be trained to discriminate cut across the differences that matter for the epistemic status of a particular bit of theoretical cognition? Now, if the answer to this last question is no, then I think epistemic relativism is false. But if the answer to that last question is yes, then I think epistemic relativism is true. Now, in the comments that I completed a few days ago, I try to explain this point a bit more vividly by appeal to an analogy with Quine's argument for the indeterminacy of translation, how translation is correct only relative to a manual. A conversation with Boghossian and Horwich yesterday helped me to see that my analogy relied on a controversial interpretation of Quine. So instead of developing my point by analogy with Quine's argument, I'll instead develop it by analogy with something I heard Daniel Dennett say a few years ago when he was trying to explain the kind of indeterminacy involved in interpreting an intentional system. I think this is a clearer analogy. So Dennett asked me to imagine a crossword puzzle to which there were two or more possible solutions. Right? Now, this is hard to imagine because usually it's hard to imagine even one possible solution for most crossword puzzles. But imagine it's possible, right, that there could be a crossword puzzle for which there were two possible solutions. Now, say you ask me, what's 38 across? Well, the right answer to that question is going to be relative to a solution, right? So relative to one possible solution, 38 across is one word, but relative to the other possible solution, 38 across is a different word. So the right answer to the question, what is 38 across, is, well, depends on which of the two possible solutions you mean. Okay, now Dennett thinks that that's analogous to interpretation of an intentional system. You ask, does this intentional system believe that P? And the answer is, well, yes, relative to this interpretation, but no relative to this other interpretation, and the two interpretations are equally good overall. Okay, now here's how the analogy would go in the epistemic case. You ask, is Galileo justified, or is whoever justified in believing such and such? And the answer is, well, yes, relative to one system of epistemic norms, but no relative to a different system of epistemic norms. And these two systems of epistemic norms are overall equally good representations of, the epistemic facts, right? The facts in the world that determine the epistemic status of your theoretical cognition. They're two overall equally good representations of that. But there's no further fact as to which is the right one. There's nothing in the world to settle it that this system of epistemic norms is right rather than that one. Okay, now I think that the epistemic relativist's best bet is to go for that view that I've just described. But is that view true? Do the differences that we can be trained to discriminate, right, the epistemic norms that we can be trained to follow, do they cut across the differences that matter for the purposes of epistemic appraisal? Can the world make true one particular system of epistemic norms to the exclusion of any other? Well, I don't know. But here, at last, I take it, we have what I regard as a reasonably clear statement of a possibly true version of epistemic relativism. If the only differences to which the cognizer can be trained to respond are finer than the differences that matter for determining epistemic status, then there is a clear sense in which the same piece of theoretical cognition can be justified relative to one system of epistemic norms and unjustified relative to another. And that's because the factors that go into determining epistemic status are, so to say, cruder than the factors mentioned in any particular set of epistemic norms. And I don't know whether or not that possibility is actualized. I've been trying to think of some reason why it might be actualized, and I haven't succeeded yet. But I'd like to see some principled argument why it can't obtain. That I'm not quite satisfied until I see that. So, in any case, just to reiterate, this version of relativism has no obvious or clear application to the anthropological cases commonly cited in defense of relativism. So if there's any truth in relativism, it's probably not a truth that should be of any interest to scholars in the humanities who study the various actual historical forms of human life. Thank you.